Alright everybody, welcome back to Psychology. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 3B, which covers the brain. So when measuring the functions of the brain, there are a couple of tools of discovery we use. One of them is the EEG, which measures electrical activity of the brain, and it works by attaching electrodes to the skull, and it's mostly used to measure brain waves during sleep. EEGs can diagnose brain damage, epilepsy, and other neurological disorders. Then there's the CT scan, which uses X-ray photographs to take X-ray photographs of the structure of the brain, and it allows doctors to see a cross-sectional image of the brain without actually cutting into it. And then there's the PET scan, which measures brain activity by injecting radioactive glucose while the brain is performing a function, and it can map brain activity. We also have lesioning, which works by destroying a piece of brain tissue with an electrode. This is usually used in animal research to see what functions become impaired when certain pieces of brain tissue are destroyed. Then there's the MRI, which uses magnetic fields and radio waves to map the structure of the brain, and these can be more beneficial than CT scans because MRIs provide a 3D image. Then there's the fMRI, which monitors brain activity, including things like blood flow, oxygen consumption, etc., with better precision than a CT scan. This is how we know that certain portions of the brain specialize in certain tasks, because more oxygen consumption equals more activity in an area. So then we get to the structures of the brain. There's the big all of these brain structures you're going to need to know, but they're all subcategories of these four. So there's the brainstem, which is the oldest part of the brain. It's composed of many structures that control functions critical to survival, such as breathing, heartbeat, things like that. And it's composed of the hindbrain and the midbrain. And then of course there's the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the forebrain. So in the midbrain is the segment of the brainstem that lies between the hindbrain and the forebrain. The reticular formation runs through it, and it is also involved in controlling automatic behaviors. The hindbrain is an extension of the spinal cord. The hindbrain is physically connected to the spinal cord. It helps regulate blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, and many other functions vital to survival. The hindbrain is itself made of the medulla, the reticular formation, the cerebellum, and the pons. The medulla controls heartbeat, breathing, blood circulation, and reflexes. The reticular formation controls wakefulness and arousal, which is just alertness and fatigue. And it is thought that anesthetics affect the reticular formation. The cerebellum coordinates movement, balance, and fine motor skills. In later units, you will also learn that the cerebellum is also involved in storing cognitive maps. The cognitive maps are routine movements like tying your shoes, opening doors, etc. The cerebellum is the first structure of the brain to be affected by alcohol. And then we get to the pons, which coordinates movements on the right and left side of the body. So in the forebrain is responsible for complex behaviors and mental abilities. The forebrain is comprised of the cerebral cortex, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, as well as the limbic system. Then in the cerebral cortex, the cerebral cortex is the outer wrinkled layer of the brain. The cerebral cortex controls all high-level functioning in the body, so advanced and complex thought processes. And the cerebral cortex is itself divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right. The two hemispheres are separated by a fissure running down the middle of the brain. This fissure extends from the front of the brain to the back of the brain, and it's called the corpus callosum. So again, you're going to need to know all the brain structures I talk about. You're going to need to memorize where they are, what their function is, whether they're part of the midbrain or the hindbrain or the forebrain or what have you. So, for example, you will need to memorize what the corpus callosum is. So the corpus callosum is a bundle of nerves that transfers information from one half of the brain to the other. This allows the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. Each hemisphere controls the motor functioning of the opposite side of the body. So your right hemisphere controls the movements of your left hand, and your left hemisphere controls the movements of your right hand. The two hemispheres of the brain also specialize in their own functions. The left hemisphere specializes in speech, language, logic, and writing. So if you are left-brained, which means you're right-handed, you also might do well in these areas. The right hemisphere specializes in spatial reasoning, art, music, and emotions. So if you are right-brained, which means you're left-handed, you might do well in these areas. But of course, there are always exceptions to the rules. So what happens when the corpus callosum is cut? If the corpus callosum allows the two hemispheres to communicate, what happens when it's severed? The corpus callosum is only severed in people who experience severe, debilitating epilepsy that does not get better with medication. As such, there are only a handful of people in the world who have had their corpus callosum cut. These people are called split brain patients. If the corpus callosum is severed, the two hemispheres cannot communicate with each other. But what does this mean for the split brain patient? Perhaps surprisingly, split brain patients can still survive and even lead a fairly normal life, even after their corpus callosum has been severed. Michael Gazzaniga, who's an important person in psychology who you need to memorize, performed many experiments on split brain patients to see how their lives were affected. He created a series of split brain experiments. These experiments went like this. So a screen is put in front of the split brain patient. On the screen could be a word like hot dog, but hot is on the left side of the screen and dog is on the right side of the screen. The patients are then asked to point to the word on the screen and then say the word on the screen. So the results of the split brain experiments are that the left hemisphere, which controls the right eye, sees the word dog because the left hemisphere controls language, and the patient is able to verbally express that they see the word dog because the left hemisphere controls language. The right hemisphere, which controls the left eye and the left hand, points to the word hot when they're asked to point to the word they see. So what they point to and what they say are different because there's two different words stored in their hemispheres. This happens because the two hemispheres are not able to communicate with each other and they can't piece together the word hot dog. The information is sort of locked inside of each respective hemisphere. So back to the cerebral cortex. You need to know about the hypothalamus, which maintains hunger, thirst, and body temperature. The hypothalamus is also the link between the brain and the endocrine system, and it also controls the autonomic nervous system, which we'll get to later. Then there's the thalamus, which is the relay center for sensory information except smell, and it sends this information to the proper place and is located in the center of the brain. So you can kind of think of the thalamus as like a postal office. Information comes in from the body, goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends that information to the proper place in the brain. So the limbic system is also part of the cerebral cortex. The limbic system regulates many basic emotions and instincts such as fear, anger, hunger, and thirst. The limbic system is made up of the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the olfactory bulb, and the cingulate gyrus. The hippocampus processes new memories. The amygdala is involved in fear and other basic emotional responses, and it's also the pleasure center of the brain. Apart from the other brain structures that we've discussed as being part of the cerebral cortex, it's also split into 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So the frontal lobe is responsible for complex thought and judgments. The frontal lobe controls how intensely you express your emotions, and it's involved in voluntary muscle movement, so raising your hand, reaching over to grab something, all that stuff. The frontal lobe is not fully developed in adolescence, which could explain why adolescents make more risky decisions. The motor cortex is located in the back of the frontal lobe, but this will be discussed in greater detail later. Besides the motor cortex, the prefrontal association area and the frontal association area make up the frontal lobe. The prefrontal association area allows us to vividly recall past events. If the prefrontal association area is damaged, we might be able to remember an event in the past, just not vividly. The frontal association controls how we feel and how we act. The frontal association area makes up the majority of our personality. If the frontal association area is damaged, our personalities might be completely different. You might have heard about this with the story of Phineas Gage, who was the train worker who had the iron rod go through his head, and it damaged his frontal association area, but he survived, and after that, his personality was completely different. These association areas and lobes and different brain structures are clusters of neurons that specialize in a particular task. So it's not like if you were to look at just the raw brain, if you were just to look at a brain, you would be able to readily pick out these different areas because it's just a cluster of neurons. So continuing with the different lobes, we have the parietal lobe, which registers and interprets sensations. If somebody shakes your hand, the parietal lobe interprets the sensation, and if somebody hits you, the parietal lobe interprets the pain. The parietal lobe is located behind the frontal lobe near the top of the brain. The sensory cortex is in the front of the parietal lobe, but this will be discussed in greater detail later. So the motor cortex and the sensory cortex are right up against each other, basically. The temporal lobe processes hearing and speech functions. It interprets what you're hearing and allows you to respond appropriately. The temporal lobe is located above the ears on both sides of the brain. Continuing along, we have the occipital lobe, which processes visual information. Images travel through the lens of the eye, landing on the back of the eyes. From there, the image is received and coded by nerves and sent to the occipital lobe so that you can understand what you see and respond appropriately. The occipital lobe is located at the base of the brain near your neck, above the cerebellum. The motor cortex, now we're going to start talking about the cortices. The motor cortex is, there's a spot on your motor cortex that corresponds to every part of your body. The motor cortex sends messages of voluntary movement to that part of your body. So there's a part of your motor cortex that corresponds to your hand, to your leg, to your feet, every part of your body that can move voluntarily, and it sends messages of voluntary movement to that part of your body. So for example, if you pick something up with your hand, your motor cortex is sending the signal to your hand to pick up that object. There is a motor cortex in each hemisphere of your brain, so your right motor cortex controls the left side of your body and vice versa. We go to the somatosensory cortex, which is also called the sensory cortex. This cortex is similar to the motor cortex in that there's a spot on the sensory cortex corresponding to each part of your body, and this sensory cortex registers the message of pain. For example, if you stub your toe on something, the message of you stubbing your toe travels from your foot to your sensory cortex where the sensation is registered. From there, the message is sent to the parietal lobe where it is to be interpreted as a painful sensation. When we talk about the cerebral cortex, we also want to talk about association areas, which are responsible for higher level functioning like learning, remembering, thinking, and speaking. Association areas can be found in all four lobes of the brain, but there are only a few that you need to know. You need to know Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and the angular gyrus. Broca's area is an association area that controls speech production. It's located in the left frontal lobe, and you should remember that the left hemisphere controls language, so it would make sense that the association area controlling speech production is located in the left frontal lobe. Then there's Wernicke's area, which interprets auditory code and makes sense of this, which might seem ambiguous now, but it will make more sense in later units when you learn about transduction, and is located in the left temporal lobe. Then there's the angular gyrus, which changes visual words into auditory code, like when you're reading out loud, and it's located in the left occipital lobe. Other association areas that are also classified as cortices are the visual cortex, which lets you read and interpret written words, and the motor cortex, which makes your muscles move when you pronounce words. When talking about the brain, we want to talk about dual processing, which is the idea that information is simultaneously processed on separate conscious and unconscious tracks in our mind. And an example of this is how we can take a walk while thinking about something completely different, like a shopping list. In the unconscious track, your brain is processing information like temperature, wind, making your legs move, and all that stuff. In the conscious track, you're talking about what you need to get from the store, what you already have at home, how much money you have to buy these things, and all that. We also want to talk about brain plasticity, and this relates to split brain patients because these two ideas are closely related. Brain plasticity is the brain's ability to modify itself and reorganize its neural pathways after suffering damage or by building new pathways based on experience. This is what happens during puberty. Your brain is building all sorts of new neural pathways and kind of getting rid of old neural pathways that aren't used so much anymore. Over time, most of the difficulties that split brain patients experience smooth themselves out as the brain finds new ways to connect the hemispheres. And that's going to be it for today's presentation, so I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Bye.